Part 2, PEP249. So PEP249 is a Python database API specification, and it's version 2 of that specification. You can read the details of it in the URL at the bottom. It's a standard API for Python allowing access to relational databases, and as I described earlier, it then makes it easy to port Python scripts from one relational database to another. It's a standard recommendation for API implementers. It is not software in itself. The API architecture contains multiple layers. You end up writing a Python script which accesses a PEP249 compliant API wrapper. That talks to a database dependent API, and that in turn talks to the relational database itself. So this first part is going to be independent of the database that you're using, whereas all these three parts are going to be specific for a particular database. Now, just to draw some comparisons with other ways of doing this, DBI is the equivalent sort of thing in the Perl programming language. And that actually adds in an extra layer. So if you write a script in Perl, you access a DBI layer, and that bit of code is itself independent of the database. And there is only one DBI layer, which means that you are guaranteed that you have a fully compliant DBI interface. That then sits on top of DBD, the database API itself, and the relational database. So here, this part is database independent, this part is database dependent. Now, that has some advantages because these wrappers that are written here for Python, a PEP249 compliant wrapper, which is database specific, may be compliant to different levels. It may not follow the rules exactly as it should. Whereas because in the Perl approach we have this DBI layer which is database independent, we know that that is a piece of existing software which will always follow the description of the API exactly. DBI allows you then also to have multiple DBD layers, and that means that a single Perl script through a single DBI interface can talk to Oracle, MySQL and PostgreSQL, amongst other things, all at the same time. Before we go into PEP249 in any more detail, I will briefly mention another alternative which is called ODBC, and that stands for Open Database Connectivity. So ODBC was actually quite an old standard. It was a consortium of database vendors in the early 1990s known as the SQL Access Group or SQL Access Group. In October 1992 and early 1993 they put together a draft standard which they called the Call Level Interface or CLI. This is an API. However, it never really caught on. The idea, of course, was that for these different vendors of databases, they would end up having a common API, a standardized API, which would allow people to access any of these databases. However, although it never really caught on, Microsoft then came along and took this CLI and embraced and extended it to create what's now known as ODBC. So can we use ODBC with Python? Well, yes we can. There are various ODBC drivers for different databases, including for MySQL. And if you go to this URL, you'll find information about those. Nonetheless, the most popular way of accessing databases from Python is to use PEP249. And in the third part of the lecture, we'll go on to describe how you actually go ahead and do that.